You've landed inside Launch Street, the Business Innovation Podcast, where we interview top innovators out there shaking things up so you can innovate, differentiate, and get further faster. Since you're here, we know you're the type of person that recognizes the importance of unlocking your innovation advantage so you can compete and win. And now, your host, the person that has worked with leading companies like Disney, Procter & Gamble, Aero Electronics, the U.S. Army Research Labs, and Red Robin on upping their innovation advantage, Tamara Gontor.
What's up, everyone? Your host, Tamara here. Hey, I've got a request that I hope you will take me up on. So many of you know, actually tens of thousands of you across the globe, we strive to make innovation tangible and real. It's why I created the Innovation Quotient Edge assessment, which I am very proud to say is the only tool to help you discover how you innovate and add value to this world. And I mean, there are tons of personality assessments out there, and they're all great, but ours is the only one that tells you specifically how you unlock your greatest competitive advantage in this crazy world. How you innovate. It's like a layer of innovation on your personality. So back to my request. Go take it. And not just the free level that gives you a hint of your superpowers. Take it and access the full report. Your full superpowers. That's where the magic is. Believe me, it's worth it. So I'm an experiential risk taker. That's my superpower. When you take it, you'll know what that means. So go to launchstreet.com and just click on Take the Assessment. Bam, your personal competitive advantage unlocked. So speaking of making innovation tangible and real, today's guest, Bob Tinker, answers a lot of questions on this topic of change or be changed that helps us do just that. And he's speaking from experience, which you know matters to me. I hate people who share quote unquote advice, but have never done it. Ugh. But Bob has. So he was the founding CEO of MobileIron, an enterprise startup that in 8 years went from 3 people on a whiteboard to over 150 million in annual revenue, over 12,000 enterprise customers, and nearly 1,000 people. He also led the business development team for Cisco's wireless business unit, a $1 billion business. And he's been VP of Business Development at Airspace, Director of Marketing at Vertical Networks, and Vice President at Nations Bank. Yup, experience. He's the author of Change or Be Changed. So let's do this. Bob, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Tamara.
All right, Bob, since this is our first time meeting, what's your first memory of being innovative?
It goes back to when I was 6. And like many things where sort of inspiration and innovation is driven by frustration, I was 6 years old and the back tire on my new two-wheeler bike was flat, which is, a tragedy for every 6-year-old. And I was a little frustrated because my father was at work and wasn't fixing my back tire. So I managed to bounce my two-wheeler down the basement stairs and figured out how to take the rear tire and chain off, put a new tube in, put it all back together, pump it back up. But the funny epilogue to it is I was too small to be able to get my bike back up the stairs.
Oh.
The tire.
Oh. But what a great lesson. And then you got help, which is maybe another great lesson, right?
Exactly. Let's just say my mother was really surprised after changing the tire.
That's awesome. So we're going to fast forward now. You grew a business from startup to IPO called MobileIron, which is in the mobile security space.
Right.
I want to actually start by digging into your journey. Curious, as you grew the company, what hurdles did you face at the different stages? Because, they're different as you grow and change.
Yeah. So, like any startup where you go from sort of nothing to something, and, I'm really proud of the fact that we went from nothing to a lot of something in terms of being over 1,000 employees and 15,000 customers. Like many startups, like in the beginning, you're just trying to get customers to pay attention to you.
Right.
And, you get a lot of no's, you get a lot of I don't cares, but you sort of have to just stay at it. And, probably the first challenge I was surprised by was going from sort of winning our first customers, where we're sort of founder-led selling, to how to build a repeatable go-to-market playbook where like normal salespeople could sell. It's sort of like as founders, you sort of sell stuff and you sort of figure, well, let's just have people do more what we're doing. But that was more of a struggle than I thought it was going to be. Another one was as the company and the marketplace went from kind of a niche in mobile security to all of a sudden everybody woke up and said, oh my gosh, this is a really big deal. Everybody piled in. Like every company and their mothers all of a sudden piled in. And now we had to kind of separate from the noise. And, that surprised me how hard that was going to be. I mean, we did it and we did a good job, but it surprised me how hard it was going to be. But the third bucket was sort of probably the most surprising for me, which is that, you sort of get things working and then you're really excited that like you figured out how to sell, you figured out how to build product, you figured out how to market, or you figured out how to run your team, or you figured out how to execute. And then suddenly what was working stops working. And it happened over and over and over again. I got to say, that pattern was sort of one of my biggest surprises over the course of taking MobileIron from 3 people to almost 1,000 was the number of times where what used to work stopped working.
Will you give us an example around that? Because that's a really, it's kind of like, I'm going to take it to the people side for a second. And maybe it's not analogous, but it's popped into my head that, sometimes your A players at one level are not your A players at the next level. I mean, it's like people and processes, right? Things work in some situations and not others.
Totally. And, I think the meta pattern observed was that what gets you from A to B often holds you back or kills you going from B to C. And that applies to the company and applies to the people. So I'll give you some examples for the company. Yeah. Like when we got to, I remember vividly, we went from 45 people to 55 people. And I felt like we got worse, not better.
Yeah.
And there's like this weird break point at like 50 people where the human brain loses its ability to keep track of a bunch of one-to-one connections. And it just catastrophically fails. And what it feels like is suddenly like the right hand and left hand that used to know what each other were doing don't. And all of a sudden, like your customer success team and your QA team that used to be perfectly coordinated now aren't. Or your sales team and your market, it just all of a sudden this sort of pod of people that was organically organized, like suddenly that doesn't work. And sort of my lesson was at about 50 people, you need to go from being organic to organized. That happened again at like 150 people, where you sort of get this like hive mind in the executive team. But now, like at 150 people, like the sales team and the engineering team are as big as the company was like a year ago. So right. All of a sudden you have like these functional tribes forming and a little bit of tribalism kicks in. And like, where did that come from? But it's a natural byproduct of sort of sub teams getting to sort of a core critical mass. And, as you start onboarding people over and over and over again, one of the things that caught us by surprise was the importance of doing good onboarding. Because when you onboard new hires, when you're in rapid growth mode, like just teaching new hires, here's what our culture is. Here's how our business works. Here's how our team works. Like just spending the time to enculturate everybody on that turned out to be one of the critical difference makers that in the early days when we weren't doing it, we sort of felt like new hires struggled to ramp. And I think, these types of breakpoints like happened over and over again. Like there's one at 50, one at 150, and another one at 450.
That's so fascinating to me. So I have a few questions for you, and one big one. They kind of ladder up to this. So, you were talking kind of going from startup to systematizing, or I really like how you said it, that organic to organized. One of the things that I find, and whether that's the full company is doing that, or maybe how the team within a company operates is doing that, because I think it can actually apply to both. One of the things I find is, in the organic phase, it's really easy to innovate, kind of like you were saying, right? When you have only fit 30 people dealing with something, right? It's very easy to collaborate. It's very easy to move quickly. It's very easy to adapt. Like those things come naturally as part of the process. And then you grow and suddenly you have to rely on processes or scaling or systematizing. And those things start to get harder. And then the people who kind of built it in the beginning start to get frustrated because it feels like that innovative space goes away. How do you keep that going Or how do you even think about it as your situation changes?
Yeah. So, there was two things that happened sequentially. One was sort of as the company grew, you do see more process. But interestingly, before that, there was a dynamic that occurred that I noticed that some of the early, more innovative folks struggled with, which is that in the early days, when you're like 50, 70, 30 people operate in multiple roles. They're sort of jack of all trades.
Yeah.
And sort of organizational boundaries are fluid and people do lots of different things. One of the natural things as you grow is that people need to start to specialize and focus on a specific role in a specific job. And some of the very early sort of jack of all trades people that love that really struggle with no longer being the jack of all trades.
Right, being more defined.
Yeah, they feel sort of constrained and they can't operate across customer success and product and engineering. And, figuring out how those people that love the jack of all trades roles can specialize and focus was one of the harder transitions in the early days. And some of the team actually was able to do that and went on to be really successful leaders in the company. Some really struggle with that. And actually the right answer for them, was to move on. Later, when we were at about 150 or 200 people, that's when sort of the process dynamic kicked in more. But in the beginning, I think the struggle for the more early innovative folks was when we went from jack of all trades to more people starting to specialize in roles. And it was a tough conversation because in the early days, you sort of pride yourselves on this, everybody wears many hats, including myself, the CEO.
Right.
And, the same thing had to apply to me, right? I had to start specializing in terms of how I was spending my time. And, those transitions where what used to work from A to B no longer works from B to C are hard on people and hard on the team. Now, successfully navigating that is a spectacular growth experience for the team. It's a spectacular growth experience for the people. And it helps you grow and learn as a person.
Yeah, it's fascinating that we're having this conversation right now because on my to-do list is to make a do, delegate, delete list. That's how someone, actually a podcast, another guest that I had on it. Yeah, told me about that.
I'm going to write that down.
Isn't that great? Do, delete, or delegate. But the reason I'm doing that is because we've hit a breaking point where I've bottlenecked us because I'm doing too much and I'm too much of jack of all trades. So it's interesting to think, as you were saying that, it was started to make me realize, you're right. I need to specialize more if we're going to grow and change. And it's hard. It's actually personally very hard to do because I enjoy a lot of it. And I also feel like I have to be in a lot of it. And you have to, I think, transition out of that mindset of like, I have to know everything.
Yes, you have to let go.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah, it's so hard.
I'll tell you some stories and analogies of sort of the on the people side. Like for me as a CEO, like over going from 3 people to 1,000, I ended up having 3 really different CEO jobs. And it sneaks up on you because your title doesn't change. Right. So,
yeah.
But the job changes. And, it often gets sort of thrown under the world of like, oh, you need to scale. And the problem is, I don't think people actually know what that means. Like everybody sort of says, oh, you got to. Well, I don't even bother defining it because I actually I think it's actually something different. I think like it's really at the core is this learning and unlearning of what takes you from A to B is not necessarily what's going to get you from B to C. And then that happens again going from C to D. So it's not like there's scale and unscale. It's a constant loop of unlearning and learning.
Yeah,
that
that's a great way to think of it.
Happens over and over and over again. So for me, like, my first CEO job was kind of like Captain America or Wonder Woman. It's like you and the platoon in the woods, like digging ditches, throwing punches, getting punched, like getting dirty.
Everybody's getting dirty. Yeah.
It's hand-to-hand combat. Like it's a blast. Like everybody feels connected. It's like you and the platoon in the woods. But then the second CEO job was more like Captain America and the Avengers. And you now all of a sudden have to hire a band of superheroes, all of whom have a better superpower than yours. So a sales superhero, a marketing superhero, a product superhero, an engineering superhero, a customer success superhero. And, in order to hire and mold and bring together a team of Avengers, like as CEO, you need to let go because no grade A executive is going to come work for a CEO who can't let go, or if they do, they're going to quit.
Yeah.
And you need to hire people that are better at you in sales and marketing and whatever. And guess what happens? The first thing that happens when they show up is they look at all the things you've been so proudly working on for the last 2 years and go, man, that's terrible. I can do way better. And, on one level that drives an insecurity and frustration. On the other level, you're like, awesome. But like sort of this transition from letting go and saying, all right, I have to sort of bring together the band of superheroes to go execute, like is a really different job. And then it happened again where sort of maybe at about 400 people, the CEO job changed again. And it felt more like Professor Xavier in the X-Men.
Yeah.
Where you're like the dean of a university and your professors are your warriors bringing up the next generation. And, as CEO, I found myself having to do a lot fewer things, but for a lot more people and having to repeat myself over and over and over and over and over again. And that drove me absolutely berserk because I was like judging my own contribution as a CEO based upon what I thought was value add from the Avengers stage. And this idea of sort of needing to repeat myself a lot felt like a waste of my time and everybody else's time. But that's actually sort of part of the job at that stage is to be a big signal generator. Yet I was getting in my own way by applying judgment and filters from sort of the previous CEO role into this next stage. So there's this constant loop of sort of unlearning and relearning at each one of these sort of role transitions, and they kind of sneak up on you. That's why I have trouble with the word scaling, because I don't think anybody knows really what to do with that. It's really more this loop of unlearning and relearning.
I think we confuse scaling and growing too. We just kind of use them interchangeably. But your comment about learning and unlearning kind of leads me to my next question, which is something that I saw you write about in an article, and I think it's also in your book as well, Change or Be Changed. You talk about when the company changes, it requires your role to change. And we're kind of talking a little bit about this from a CEO perspective, but kind of from a bigger perspective from where you're coming from with this book. How do we ensure that we evolve with the demands of our job? Because you're really, like, as you're talking, like I said, you're talking from the CEO perspective, but all of us innovators out there are going, oh my God, that's all of us right now.
This happens to everybody. Right. Yeah, it is. I'm glad you brought that up because it's absolutely not something that's unique to the CEO. Any leader or innovator will go through this exact same dynamic. And, I think we spend so much time in sort of entrepreneurship and innovation focused on learning, which is really important. But what we don't talk about is unlearning, which is what are the things that we used to do that we need to stop doing or change? And I think those are two sides of the same coin. And I think it's a really powerful concept that really forces a level of self-awareness in people and in myself about, hey, what am I doing that I need to stop doing? Sort of your delete or delegate list, right? What am I doing that I need to stop doing? Or how do I need to change my behavior? And what do I need to become for this next role, whether I'm a leader, a director, a manager, an innovator, CEO, it doesn't matter. And, the first step is actually recognition. So to put a point on your question, like how do people make sure they don't get trapped? The first step is sort of recognizing that your job is changing. Like you'd be surprised, it kind of sneaks up on you. So just recognizing that your job is changing and then unlearning your old role and relearning your new role. It sounds easy, but in real life, like I said, it sneaks up on you. It actually feels scary because in many ways you have to let go of the very things that you think you're good at and the way you view yourself adding value. So it creates insecurity. But it's one of the most spectacular sort of personal and professional growth experiences you can have, which is to sort of unlearn the way you used to work and learn what you need to do going forward.
So you're totally the timing could not, this is why I love my job. Like the timing could not be better. And I feel like maybe I need to create a learn and unlearn list, not just a like tactical delegate list.
I would totally suggest that. Like,
yeah.
And here's the key.
Yeah.
Self-awareness. Like in order to recognize the change, figure out what you need to unlearn and relearn, like there's got to be a really crystal clear mirror of self-reflection and self-awareness in order to do that. And that's hard because a lot of the stuff that you get good at becomes almost automatic, becomes habit, becomes inertia. It's just how you do what you do. And that's what makes you good at what you do. And being able to sort of recognize those things, be like, maybe that's not what I should be doing going forward. You know, like there were times, like I'll give you a good example for me. So I was a very sort of product and sort of customer centric CEO in the beginning. Like that's just sort of my heritage. I sort of grew up being sort of a product guy and a customer guy. Well, once the company sort of got to product market fit, we sort of got our first 20, 30 customers and we started to bring in a go-to-market team. Like I needed to be the CEO for the whole company, not just the CEO for the product and a couple customers. Right.
Yeah.
And, I struggled, and I think a lot of product centric CEOs and leaders sort of struggle with that. And I ended up working with an executive coach who really helped me on this, which is to force me to think in swim lanes, like to break the company down into like 3, 4, 5 swim lanes. You have a product swim lane, a customer swim lane, a go-to-market swim lane, a team swim lane, a finance swim lane, like whatever the right swim lanes are for your business. Like break up your business into swim lanes and then paint the target for where you want to be a year from now. Not like what do you need to do next week, which is very like one foot in front of the other, but paint the target like a year out. Like where do you want to be in 6 months or a year, and then work backwards as to what needs to happen and pay really close attention to how you're spending your time. And all of a sudden it becomes like big in your face. You're like, oh my God, I'm spending like 80% of my time there because that's what I like to do and that's what I used to do. And the amount of my time that's spread across these other swim lanes, all of a sudden I'm like, oh, that's a problem. So just going through that exercise of forcing myself to think in swim lanes, be much more deliberate about how I'm spending my time and what my goals are and what the team's goals are, not just in the stuff that I like and that I'm good at, but in what the company needs, was just a great example of like a painful sort of rewiring exercise I went through in sort of the early stage.
So one of the reasons I'm kind of digging in here and really intrigued by this is, in our work, and I'm sure you've seen this, across yours as well, that we're seeing really 4 massive disruptors from really not just a company perspective, but a personal perspective. And a couple of those just being like, the even playing field, right? There's 1 million of us in the workforce right now adding value. There's 5 generations. So the war on talent is on. On top of that, you've got continuous disruption, like things constantly happen, whether that's technology, customer expectations, all of that. You've got change that's happening. And on top of that, you have technology taking over a lot of what our jobs used to do. So now we have to redefine value. But I think part of that is kind of to your point is if we can figure out what we need to unlearn and what we need to now know or learn, then we can figure out where our value is versus just constantly being fearful that technology is taking our jobs away, or that, I'm a Gen Xer. I'm that jerk squeezed in the middle, but like the millennials taking my job. Right. So instead of thinking of it that way, thinking about, well, what do I now need to be able to accomplish or to do?
Yeah. I think this sort of concept of unlearning and relearning sort of allows people to not get trapped in situations where they feel like their job goes away because your job changes. Right. And I think, in many ways, like, for the book, Change or Be Changed, that frustration was sort of the inspiration behind it, which that I think like the entrepreneurial and innovation community, like we're really good at helping people build product, but I think we're not that great at helping them build go-to-markets. That's sort of bug number 1. But bug number 2 is that I think we do a pretty bad job of helping entrepreneurs and innovators understand how their jobs change as their companies change. And like, as the company changes, your job changes, and therefore you have to change, or frankly, you will be changed. Right? I mean, that's sort of the ruthless part about it. But if you sort of look at it logically, like it's of course what should happen, right? If the role changes, either you need to change to fit the role or you get changed. And, you can look at that through one lens and say, wow, that's really scary. Or on the other hand, you can look at it and be like, wow, that's an opportunity to sort of unlearn and relearn a new role and adapt to whatever needs to be next. And I think that makes sort of people and innovators and leaders, like if you embrace it rather than fear it, it's empowering, but it's also really fun.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think I'm an opportunistic. I'm like, let's go find the damn water if the glass is half full. So
exactly,
like it's actually really fun. But I do think that for a lot of us, to your point, first of all, it's comfortable, right? We know what we know. We know how to add value. We know we have been successful in this way, at least perceived. And I think on top of it, we're in denial. So change only takes us by surprise when we're not paying attention or we're trying to avoid it because we know it's there, right? I mean, come on, it's there. It's always happening. So we have to your point about kind of that self-awareness and reflection, I think we have to be a little bit more willing to do that up front.
Yes. And I think the self, what ended up really helping me was one, like just trying to get better about being self-aware and self-reflection. The other thing, unsurprisingly, is listen to your team.
What does that mean?
Well, so I would get some pretty harsh feedback from my team. If the company was not getting what it needed from me because the job was changing and I wasn't, like there were a couple of my leaders that would unload on me and really give me some pretty like direct critical feedback on, hey, X isn't happening and X needs to happen, or you need to stop doing Y. And, and that was a really helpful signal to sort of cause me to be like, oh, wait a minute, I had to pay attention here. Now, sometimes I dig in and be like, okay, maybe I disagree. But most of the time I dig in and be like, there's a there. So, the combination of self-awareness, but also inviting and welcoming critical feedback from the people around you and not being defensive about it and being willing to be vulnerable about it. Like that was sort of the other major source of signals to me for when change was happening that maybe I wasn't like as attuned to as I needed to be.
Well, and that in some ways is the ultimate test of ego too, isn't it? And how much true confidence you have versus ego you have if you're willing to accept.
I love that you brought that up.
Yeah, well,
I think ego is the ultimate enemy of leadership at the end of the day because it becomes about you, not the mission. And so whenever you let your ego get in the room, like it's just going to get in the way. So you got to leave your ego at the door.
And frankly, nobody wants to work for the leader who thinks they're always right. It's not fun to do. You don't contribute. It's not fun.
It's exhausting and usually doesn't work.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So I want to talk about the other side for a second because we've been talking about kind of motion and action. And that is because you have a whole chapter or segment really in your book about culture. Mm-hmm. But how does cultural inertia, as you talk about it, hinder innovation? Because sometimes I think that's the biggest thing we're battling in business. It isn't failure, actually. It's inertia.
Yeah. And I think, the culture topic is a fascinating one because, if your product is like your company's muscle and your team is your company's brain, culture is your company's soul. And, culture comes from the leaders and the early employees and the founders. And, it's this sort of diffuse thing that permeates the entire organization. But that doesn't mean it's undefined. Like, I actually think it's really important for culture to be well defined. Now, that comes with it a risk. And I think this gets to your question about where does culture and cultural inertia hinder innovation? And that's where culture goes from this common thread that binds everybody together and guides them on tough decisions and attracts talent to where culture becomes dogmatic and culture becomes a straitjacket. And that, like everything, sort of greatest strengths can be greatest weaknesses. Like the times where I've seen culture and cultural inertia become an issue is when culture becomes rigid and the culture becomes dogmatic, and you hear phrases like, well, this is just the way we are, or
This is how we do it here.
This is how we do it. And you hear things like that, and your antenna should go up and be like, well, wait a minute, like, is that actually true? And is that actually sort of a foundational truth that cannot be changed? I think, what I saw seeing a company go from like 3 to 1,000 people and being part of that is that, the culture evolved, and, it doesn't change fast. Like, it's not like one day it wakes up and changes, but like, the culture in the company for the first 3 to 4 years was pretty constant. But then as we started to hit hyper growth and build go to market, we had to create a more balanced culture between product and go to market where both were valued rather than just being product centric. And then as the company got to be really large, we had to create a culture that valued both the innovators and the optimizers. Like at about 500 people, that was a surprising cultural tension I saw where you hire, you're at that scale and you're thinking about going public. You need to have people in the organization that are making sure like the trains run on time, you don't screw stuff up.
Yeah.
Like they're the optimizers. And then you've got other people who are sort of the chain breakers and the innovators who like mess stuff up kind of on purpose. And you have to figure out how those two cultures actually blend. And there's a lot of tension around that. And I think the thing we sort of figured out the hard way was the best way to deal with that is just acknowledge it. That look, at this scale, we have sort of two different things going on at the same time. We have part of the company that's working on optimization, and we have part of the company that's working on like change and messing stuff up and innovating in a mobile industry. And just acknowledging that both those things were there kind of helped sort of diffuse that. But, without evolution in culture as your company change, culture and cultural inertia will end up being sort of what holds the company back.
So I'm so glad you brought up that innovators and optimizers. I want to spend a couple minutes here because I think, from my perspective, everybody has room to innovate, and optimizing in its own way is innovating.
Everybody can do both.
Yeah, for sure. And I think organizations that really win, everybody's innovating in some way with the work they have in front of them. So you might have a group, to your point, who's over there breaking stuff and coming up with the latest technology or the latest products. But there's innovation across the company. But regardless, you still have the managers or the people who are putting it into action and the people who are, more responsible for new ideas. And I think you have to have that across companies. I got two questions for you actually. One is, how do you identify that tension exists? And I know that sounds like an obvious question, but I think those cues of like, hey, we've got some tension between the two sides of the table, was it the Montagues and the Capulets? Did I get my Shakespeare right? Like, how do we, that's probably not right because they're not working together, but you know what I mean?
Right.
How do you identify that tension exists? And then what do you actually do to overcome it?
So, you often can identify, sometimes it's really obvious that there's tension because there's, it's like, you can see it everywhere. Like there's, decisions that are stuck because are we going to, which way are we going to do it? But I found that there's like this, like on a hot day, when you look over a blacktop road, there's sort of like this shimmer in the air where you can sort of see the tree, but it's sort of like, it's, shimmering and kind of hard to see. You sort of the disturbance in the air coming up off a hot road. I find you have the same thing in a company. Like sometimes you'll sort of see an area where like there's this shimmer, that there's like this distortion field around a particular topic or something that's going on. And like sometimes it's because people are talking about it. Sometimes it's because people are avoiding it. And you can just kind of see this like weird shimmering distortion field around something. That's usually a clue that there's some sort of issue or tension in there that's unresolved. So I sort of would tune my radar to look for those things and sort of dig in. And then how do you deal with it? I found actually just admitting and talking about it literally is like half the problem. Like just saying, hey, there are two different sort of cultures that are evolving in the company because of where we are, and that's okay. And let's be explicit about sort of where we're focused on what. Like, okay, in sales forecasting, we need to be focused on optimization and precision because it matters if you're thinking about going public. But hey, in the product and engineering teams, we have, folks that are focused on, scrubbing bugs and releasing high quality software. And we got other people that are working on stuff that's like totally rough around the edges and messy. Just admitting it and then being explicit about it, I found was more than half the problem, because then it diffused the tension and everybody could just talk about it. I find when the tension's there and people aren't talking about it, that's when things vapor lock and the company stalls. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you sort of get that distortion field where you're kind of going, uh-oh, something's going on in there.
I love that, because I can't tell you the number of meetings I think all of us have been in, but I know for myself personally, where you can't, something's not quite right, but you can't put your finger on it. But people aren't saying the real things and they're not having the right conversations. They're avoiding some topics.
Yep.
But it's all very happy and comfortable at the same time. And you're like, hold on, something's not right here, but I don't know what it is.
Yeah. I wish I could give this credit to whoever shared this concept with me, but I can't remember where it came from. It's been
it's always Ben Franklin, if you don't remember.
Yeah. Well, it's this concept called what's the question behind the question?
Yeah, right.
A lot of times people will be asking questions, but it's actually really behind it is another question. And it'd be like, so what's the question behind the question that we're all talking about here? And sometimes that'll flush it out.
Isn't that? Yeah, I agree. I think it's often the why behind the question too. Of
that's fair. I agree.
Yeah, what are they really trying to get to? And you're right. And I think as humans, we tend to hold stuff close to the vest. And I don't know that we mean to. I don't think we're even half the time realize we're doing it. But we don't say the deep down thing. We say the easy thing, the safer thing, really.
Yeah, and that interestingly becomes sort of a culture topic too. That one of the things that I highly valued in our culture and sort of reinforced, and I would encourage in other cultures, is something I call intellectual honesty, which is celebrate the good, but talk about the bad.
Yeah.
Because, that's how you grow, is by, celebrating the good, but also talking about what's not going well. And I think giving people permission to talk about what's not going well is a really, really, really important thing in a company. And, we made that part of our culture, and it was fascinating. Like one time the director of QA came in, he's like, all right, I may be betting my job here, but I'm going to put the intellectual honesty card on the table and talk to you about, a big turd that he was worried about. Right. And I was like, awesome, bring it on. We started off every all hands meeting with what's going well and also what's not going well. We would talk about what's not going well. And, that giving people permission to talk about what's not going well is a really powerful tool for a company. Now, there's an interesting side effect as we grew. Well, as we grew and sort of the culture evolved, some people, as we got larger, took celebrate the good, talk about the bad as permission to kind of be I'm trying to not use a bad word, permission to be a significant jerk.
Some people take it a little too far.
And we realized that we had to clarify that as part of the culture, which was look, celebrate the good, talk about the bad, but be constructive.
Yeah.
And so, giving people permission to talk about what's not going well is really important. But I think one of the things we learned a little later on is we had to be a little more explicit about expecting that needed to be constructive, not sort of just being a jerk.
Right. No, there has to be a level of respect that goes along with it. And I want to loop it back to the kind of your whole thing about change or be changed. Mm-hmm. I'd love to hear your perspective. I would assume that ability to be honest and to have those conversations, good and bad, helps you evolve and change. And I would say that the opposite, keeping things superficial, hiding the, elephants in the room or behind the distortion fields, probably keeps you trapped.
I agree. And that is, the number one thing that enables people to unlearn and relearn and go through successfully navigate the change or be changed dilemma is that self-awareness. And self-awareness applies to people, what's going well, what's not going well. Self-awareness applies to companies. Like the ability to sort of talk about what's not going well is like organizational self-awareness. Right?
Isn't that true?
Right. And, if you sort of think about it, it kind of makes sense. Like looking in the mirror is hard for a person. It's kind of uncomfortable. But looking in the mirror is also hard and kind of uncomfortable for a team. Right. It's kind of natural. It's human nature. But ironically, I think we would all agree that that's the only way we actually really learn is to actually look in the mirror. And so, I think the solution to change or be changed and the solution to unlearning and relearning, like the critical ingredient in all of that is self-awareness.
So how do you, this is going to sound like I don't even know how to answer this question. So how do you gain self-awareness? Or because I think a lot of us think
that is a great question.
I think I think we can all list.
We can all do better.
We can all do better, but I think we can also list people who would say they're self-aware, but if you look at their actions, you're like, I don't know about that.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny because like it ended up that what I realized is that in terms of like the leaders and the execs I want to work with, self-awareness became sort of the number one thing for me because I found that if it wasn't there, it became sort of exhausting.
Yeah.
But it's really hard to sort of interview for self-awareness, right? Like
very hard.
And so it took me a little while to figure this out, but I think I've at least identified maybe one core pattern that's a strong signal to both people and teams that can be self-aware is, are you willing to be vulnerable?
Big one.
Because like that's really the fear and insecurity that usually is what keeps people from being self-aware is, are you willing to be vulnerable? And like, if you see people are willing to be vulnerable and, you sort of let them be vulnerable about things, I find that really helps sort of develop self-awareness.
And I would have to imagine that people who are open and willing to be vulnerable are going to be self-aware. Like I'm sure that correlation there.
Yeah, and it's funny because
it
feels like weakness, but ironically, it's the exact opposite.
Right.
Right. And actually, the people see that. Like, the team sort of responds to leaders who are willing to admit they're wrong.
Yeah.
Or talk about what they're not good at because it inspires trust. They're like, okay, they're not going to run us off the cliff. This leader's not going to run us off the cliff because of their ego.
Well, and it actually takes a lot of strength to say, I don't know.
Yeah. Or I was wrong.
Yeah.
Or, willing to be vulnerable. That's, we can all get better at self-awareness. And I think we can all try. I think the being willing to be vulnerable and be able to take critical feedback and not be defensive are sort of the two key ingredients. And
that is great advice right there. So before we finish up, I just have to know, because I meant to ask you in the beginning, but we dug in so fast. It was so good that I don't want to go back. What inspired you to actually write the book? Is it change or be changed? Because we've been talking about a lot of concepts, but it's a really powerful thought and a really challenging one for a lot of us. Like, oh my God, if I don't change, right, so it's coming for me.
Well, I think, like many things, sort of frustration is the mother of inspiration. And, I think in the entrepreneurial community and innovator community and just, the business community writ large, that I don't think we do a very good job of helping leaders understand how, as their companies changes and their roles change, like they have to change themselves or be changed. And I think we just leave them to boil like a frog in a pot till they get shot, right? And you see a lot of really good leaders, get stuck. And it's not because they weren't capable of evolving and learning and unlearning. It's just because there's not a lot of institutional knowledge passed down about, hey, as your jobs change, here's how, you need to be able to change yourself.
Right. Here's how you learn and unlearn.
Yeah. And I felt like those were all the things that I wish like somebody had sort of sat me down and whacked me around on this stuff. Because when you're trying to build a company from scratch, like it's sort of like flying an airplane and pulling up on the stick with all your strength to try and gain altitude. Like the last thing you want to do is rip open the fuselage and screw around with the wiring. But that's exactly what you have to do. And I just don't think we do a very good job as a community sort of helping leaders sort of know what's that like and help give them tools to do it. So it was cool when we wrote the book and started to, pull together all these stories about CEOs learning and unlearning and leaders learning and unlearning, and teams learning and unlearning, that a lot of other people started to pitch in. Like Mark McLaughlin from Palo Alto, or Mark Templeton from Citrix, Phil Fernandez from Marketo, Aaron Levy from Box, Teen Zoe from Zuora. Like all of us that have sort of been through the grinder on this, we all had stories to share about sort of how we had to change or be changed. And, it made it a really fun project because then everybody else started to kick in all these stories. And, hopefully it'll sort of be a service to sort of the next generation of entrepreneurs.
One of the things I was just thinking as you were talking is one of the most powerful things, whether you're an entrepreneur or you work inside a company, that you can do to start the process of really leveraging change and innovating and not becoming irrelevant is be the first person to be willing to be open about it. Because kind of what you're saying about like you said something, then someone else said something, then somebody else chimed in. It always takes that first person, doesn't it, to be like, hey, turns out I was kind of making it up as I went because things changed on me.
Yep. And, it's amazing when you sort of unleash that and collect that input and that wisdom. Like, I hope it'll be really useful for everybody, but it was really fun to be able to sort of pull together these stories from all these different entrepreneurs and, hopefully help those that come after us not trip into all the same ditches we did.
Yeah, right. Well, there are some big ones on my side. I can tell you that for sure. Where can people go to learn more and connect with you? Get the book.
Thank you for asking. So the book will be available on Amazon in about 2 weeks. It'll be available early June. We also have a website, survival-to-thrival.com. And yes, we know Thrival is not a real word.
It's all right. We all make up our own words these days.
It makes it memorable. So survival-to-thrival.com. Or please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn as well. I'm listed under Bob Tinker.
Awesome. Bob, this has been great. What's your final piece of advice for those seeking to not be changed?
The unlearn. We spend so much time learning. Yeah. Spend just as much time unlearning. It's a really empowering concept, and it's fun. I'm
telling you, you just rocked my world. I'm going to change my list to learn and unlearn. And then maybe the delete and delegate will be the tactics that go to it. But I love that.
I like that framework. I think that's a great framework.
Yeah. Clearly, I like my frameworks and my patterns. So, how do I turn this into something?
As do we all.
Well, Bob, this has been great. Thank you so much for coming by. It was just absolutely insightful. And like I said, this whole concept of learn and unlearn at every stage is almost a little bit relieving because I think it gives us all permission to not know what we're doing versus feeling like, oh my God, I should know this. It's
Amen.
Okay that you don't,
Amen. All right, Tamara, thank you very much for having me. It was an honor.
Hey, peeps. Just a quick reminder before you go. Go to our website and discover your innovator archetype, aka your innovation advantage. It's worth it. Tamara out.
Thanks for hanging with us on Inside Launch Street. If you know someone that is truly ready to unlock their innovation advantage, have them join you on Launch Street. Discover your innovation advantage. Build a team of high-performing innovators and ignite ideas and solutions that create massive impact. GOTO, launchstreet.com. Remember, innovators, if you don't take the leap, somebody else will.